This is a meeting with Mr. Hamid Qajar on the 26th of November 1981 in London. And perhaps, we could begin by having you describe, your earliest memories of your father and his life in Europe and his memories about Iran. And just about anything else that occurs to you, I think will be very precious to anyone who will be listening to these tapes in the next 50 to 100 years.
Well, my memories of my father only started when I left Tabriz as a very small child to come to Tehran and live with him in the palace of Gulistan, where he was heir to the throne. I left Iran when I was about 4 years old, perhaps even less, to come to Europe to be educated in England on the insistence of my father. I came with my younger sister, Avdas, and we stopped off in Constantinople, where my grandfather, محمدحسن, was living at that time. He had been exiled from Iran in 1909 in favor of his son, Ahmad Shah, and at that time he went to live in Odessa in Russia. He stayed there until the revolution of 1918, at which time he, his wife, my two other uncles, Sultan Mahmud and Sultan Majid, were living with him, including my aunt, their younger sister. Correction. She was not their younger sister. I think in fact that she was in between the two brothers. Let's say after the revolution, they all came to Constantinople, where I joined them. As my grandfather and my grandmother thought that I was too young to continue the voyage to England, they kept me there with my elder brother, Hussein Qajar, whom I had met for the first time in my life. Correction, whom I met for the first time in my life. Hussein had been born, like myself, in Tabriz, but at the age of 40 days, he was sent to join our grandfather in Odessa, and so traveled with them from Russia to Constantinople when they fled. We stayed in Constantinople, and then the whole family again uprooted itself and went to San Remo in Italy, where a year or so later, my grandfather died. The whole family once again, after that event, left San Remo and went to Paris. We stayed in Paris, my elder brother and I, for about another year, and at the end of that time, when I was 7 years old, we finally proceeded to London, in England, arriving there when I was 7 years old. in 1925. The reason why we came to England, or rather the reason why my father chose England for us to be educated, was because he had a friend in a gentleman called Sir Percy Heren-Maxwell, whom the family had met or knew in Russia. My recollections are slightly hazy here, but Sir Percy Heren-Maxwell had been a friend in one form or another of the family, as he had at one time been in business in Russia and presumably at that time had connections with them. Understandably, neither my brother nor I spoke a word of English when we arrived, and in fact spoke practically no Persian. He certainly spoke no Persian, and only in reality Russian. The reason I didn't speak Persian was because in the family in Azerbaijan the language was Turkish, and it continued. And we continued speaking in that language even after arrival in Constantinople, as my grandfather and family all spoke that language amongst themselves, or in their case Russian, as they had been brought up in their youth in Russia. So this meant that on being taken over by the Heren-Maxwell family, we literally spoke no English. But at that time, Lady Heren-Maxwell had started a school in Baraheath, and we joined the other young boys and girls at the school.
Was anyone else with you when you came to England? Was it just yourself and your brother, or did you have...
We were brought over to England by Saleh Khan, السلطنه, whom I believe belonged to the Logman family and was a secretary to my father. But after having delivered us to England, he returned to Paris. All this was followed by a variety of schools, basically learning English one way or another. Until we had, by we I mean my brother and I, had both reached what was called at that time the Junior Cambridge School Certificate or Junior Oxford School Certificate. And after that, Hussein, my brother, chose to become an agriculturist and went to the Royal Agricultural College at Cirencester, written Cirencester, and I joined HMS Worcester, Thames Nautical Training College at Greenhithe in Kent.
And how long were you there at this college?
It's a 2-year course. I was there from 1934 to 1936. and after I had obtained the scholastic and nautical degrees, I joined the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company as a cadet, as an indentured cadet to that company. My father had arrived in England from Paris, but we saw very little of him, and in many ways he was like a stranger to us. And of course, since leaving Persia, neither my brother nor I had seen our mother. Our mother's, should I say mother?
Where was she? She was
in Tehran.
She'd remained in Tehran.
She'd remained in Tehran. After leaving the Worcester, as I say, I was indentured to the Royal Mail and sailed in 1936 for South America as a cadet on a vessel of 3,000 deadweight tons. After working on the South American trade for a short period, I was transferred to the West Indian ships of that company. Actually, they went through the West Indies and up through Panama to the west coast of America. In 1939, in April 1939 to be exact, I left the Royal Mail and through a cousin on the Russian branch of the family, Qajar, who had been instrumental in putting Elizabethaden on the map, after which he joined Helena Rubinstein, and he was there when I first met him. I joined Mobil Oil in London. This cousin of mine had a friend by the name of Michel Bertin, who was a senior foreign aid executive, or rather foreign trade executive, in Mobil Oil at that time.
Why did you leave? Why did you sort of change careers?
I got fed up with the sea. I could see no great future in it anyway. But did not know when I left, like most other people did not know, that there could possibly be a war later on that year.
I see. This was before the war had...
In April 1960.
Yeah.
When war was declared in September of 1939, I tried hard to join the Royal Navy, but found that it was not going to be quite that easy. It must be remembered that I was a foreigner, and in the confusion at that time, it was difficult really to see how I could go about doing this. However, through the Heren-Maxwells, we had already met a family called the Thesigers, where one of the brothers was an admiral in the Royal Navy. And after a great deal of pushing and pulling, wheeler and dealing, I was accepted into the Royal Navy in 1942 as a sub-lieutenant. And I left Mobil Oil then and proceeded into the Navy.
And where did you serve? What was sort of your wartime experience?
My first ship was HMS Conqueror, which was an ACAC ship. By that I mean an anti-aircraft ship, sailing up and down the North Sea. On patrol. In 1943, my father suddenly died, Maidenhead, in peculiar circumstances, at least. One thought they were peculiar, as he was perfectly healthy. And the Admiralty were kind enough to give me leave of absence from sea duties for 6 months and put me into the anti-submarine warfare division of the Admiralty in London, whilst I tried to sort out my father's affairs. Before all this happened, in 1939 also, my elder brother Hussein had gone to Canada, had in fact emigrated to Canada. However, on the outbreak of war, he also tried to return to England to join the Navy, and managed to do so shortly after my father had died. So, on his return to England in 1943, I met him, since I last saw him in 1939. He was put on. He joined the Navy and was drafted to minesweepers based in the south of England.
Were you able to, either of you able to attend your father's funeral, or did you get there too late?
There was no funeral as such. My father was embalmed and subsequently put in a shallow grave, and I arranged a memorial service for him at Caxton Hall in London through the good offices of people like Sir Hassan Sohrawadi, who was then advisor to the Secretary of State for India, Mr. Leopold Amery, and others like Mr. Firuz Khan of India,
and then where was he finally the body rested?
After the war, arrangements were made to return the body to the family tomb in Karbala, in Iraq.
So after the war was over, what did you do?
Well, during the war, I served after the arrangements concerning my father were completed. I returned to sea in HMS Duke of York, which was then the flagship of the Home Fleet, serving Russian convoys. When the Duke of York finished and had to return to England to be refitted, I was transferred to a frigate called HMS Wild Goose, which was the leading frigate of the second support group, sailing out of Liverpool western approaches, and consisted of five bird-class sloops whose duty was simply to kill submarines in the Atlantic. When the war with Germany was finished, I obtained leave of absence from the Admiralty to make a quick visit to Paris to see the family, who had been in France throughout all this period, as I hadn't seen them since well before the war, actually since 1934, if my memory serves me right.
Who were the remaining family members there?
The family consisted of my grandmother, who was still alive,
Muhammad
Ali Shah's wife, two uncles, Sultan Mahmud and Sultan Majid, and the whole of the family retinue, which was still in a way ancient Persia, and quite considerable in numbers.
Were they actually in Paris or outside of Paris?
They were actually in Paris itself, in Saint-Cloud. They owned a house in Saint-Cloud.
Must have been a large house too.
It was a very large.
So many people.
It was a very large house. The retinue were getting on in years. By that I mean each individual was getting older, of course. And in a way it was still really ancient Iran. They still wore, the women wore the chador. And they behaved in a way. It wasn't really ancient Persia and it wasn't modern Persia. It was something in between. As they had left, as I said before, they had left Iran in about 1909 and hadn't been back in Iran after Russia.
At this point, maybe we could go back to your father and what you recollect or were told about his sort of life in Tehran as the crown prince and the circumstances that led to his departure.
My father and his elder brother Ahmad Shah, at a very young age, well, since 1909, since my grandfather had to leave, became king and heir and stayed together until the fall of the Qajars. Ahmad Shah was in Paris when the actual
end of the Qajar,
the actual end of the
dynasty occurred.
When the dynasty fell, he had left for Europe I'll go back on that. I had seen Ahmad Shah once in my life in Constantinople when he came to visit his father. And that's the only time I ever saw him. He was extremely good looking. By that I mean not good looking in the sense of he had a very noble face in the same way as my father did, and they got that from their mother. Ahmad Shah spent a lot of his time in Europe, and when the family actually fell, when the dynasty actually fell, he was not in Iran. He came, there were two revolutions. One was when Reza became Prime Minister, and I think that was
1923.
In 1923. And Ahmad Shah came back and stayed a short time in Iran at that time, then left again for Paris. And in reality he never came back. And when in 1925 Parliament voted against the Qajars, it was my father, who was then living in the Golistan Palace in Tehran, who was shown to the frontier and left for Paris.
Was there anything that the family desired to do or could do to change the course that history was taking while your father was in Tehran, to persuade members of the parliament?
Well, it's always been said that on his voyage to England, Ahmad Shah was asked by the British government, I assume in the form of Lord Curzon, to make a speech at the Guildhall in London in order to bring in British experts into Iran. And this did not mean that Iran would become a kind of a colony of England, but that things like the police, the customs, the post, etc., would be trained by the English, and it would give the English a foothold in Iran, a bigger foothold perhaps than they had at that time. Ahmad Shah categorically refused to do this, his argument being that his grandfather, Muzaffar Shah, had given to Iran its first parliament. In other words, that Iran was a democracy ruled by parliament. And his contention was that if the parliament in Persia agreed to the English proposal in the first instance, then he, as a democratic monarch, would ratify their conclusion. But that he could not do it the other way around. That is to say that he, in England, would accept it and then force his decision through Parliament. Having done that, he left England and went to Paris. And I'm told that Sir Percy Lorraine, I don't know what his position was at that time,
ambassador, I believe, to Iran,
continuously went to Paris asking Ahmad Shah to rescind his decision, and so I'm told that if he had done so, the Qajars, in the eyes of the English, would have been guaranteed 1,000 years. But Ahmad Shah refused. And by that time, Reza Khan had already been chosen or looked at favorably by General Ironside in the context of perhaps a future dictator or leader of a republic. And the coup was made. During the war, and before Rezaqi was actually deposed in 1943, there had been many meetings in London with my father and various members of the British government when it had been decided that Rezaqi would be set aside because of his familiarity and friendliness with certain German elements in southern Persia at that time, and that the Qajars would be returned to the throne of Persia, which my father firmly believed. But anyway, this was in agreement with Sir Anthony Eden, who was then Foreign Secretary at the time. But in the interim, Sir Walter Monckton, as I understand it, was sent to Persia to make an on-the-spot examination of the position. And he apparently had long conversations with Mr. Foroughi, who was then Prime Minister in Iran. And Mr. Foroughi managed to change the thinking in London by suggesting to Sir Walter Monckton that perhaps then was not the time to carry out this operation, as all the rolling stock for the Russian armed forces were passing through southern Persia to the north, through southern Persian ports to the north and to Russia, and that if such a drastic change in the interior politics of Persia were made at that time, it could perhaps unsettle the smooth flowing of this rolling stock, which I believe to be completely untrue. Many years after all this happened, I was speaking to a very senior Persian of the Nuri family, of the Nuri Esfandiari family, who told me that everything in Tehran had already been arranged then to receive my father on his return. So it is really a little difficult to know what to believe. Suffice it to say, it didn't happen.
Were you yourself aware that these things were happening at the time, or were you told about them later?
No, I was fully aware and partook in the conversations. And literally one day after lunch in London, with Sir Anthony Eden and various other members of the British cabinet, my father and I, in walking through Green Park, honestly thought that the next day we'd be asked to return to Tehran. My father had been asked at luncheon, because I was then still in the Navy, whether he was prepared to take me back with him, or what did he intend, and he said no, he was going to take me with him back to Iran.
Would your brother Hussein have come too? Or was there any discussion as to...
My brother Hussein was not in England at that time. And in fact there was no discussion from that point of view at all. One doesn't know quite really what would have happened if we had returned.
Could you tell us a little more about your father, his personality, his thoughts, his...
My father had a very strong personality, but in a similar manner as his brother, the Shah, Ahmad Shah, had never really been educated. Neither of the two boys had ever been to school. They'd grown up under the auspices of various teachers in Tabriz and followed by Tehran, and had very little inkling of what the outside world was all about.
How were they actually taught? Did they have a private tutor, or?
I think they had private tutors in Iran.
Were they Iranians, or?
Yes, the teachers were Iranians. If either one or the other spoke any foreign language at all at that time, it would have been a smattering of French.
What language did they speak between the two of them?
They spoke Persian and probably Azerbaijani Turkish.
Mm-hmm. And with their mother the same language?
The mother with the same language, with possibly the added smattering of Russian, which she had picked up during her stay in Russia. Mm-hmm. But the language within the family, certainly within the old generation, was Azerbaijani Turkish. It must be understood that in our dynasty, the heir to the throne is always governor of Azerbaijan, which is the largest province of Iran, and of course, in a way the most important, as it borders Russia for 3,000 kilometers.
So, in fact, when Ahmad Shah was out of Iran, it was your father who carried on the duties of the king.
Yes. In going back again to 1941 and the various meetings in London, I've never been quite sure in my own mind whether it was the intention to take back my father. No, that's incorrect. I think the intention was to take back my father, but with a limited stay, as he was too coloured by the older elements of the dynasty. And to try that approach, first of all, before putting in a younger man of a newer generation.
Was there any discussion as to who that person would be?
Well, the impression I got was it would be me, and this, in a way, is brought out in quite a number of the Shah's books, the late Shah, Reza Pahlavi, in which he actually mentions that the British were in contact with a young Qajar who had served in the Royal Navy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't it have been your brother who was older?
Well, my brother by that time was Canadian.
I see.
And well, that's really the only thing that I can think of.
Mm-hmm. As far as you know, what role did your father play in internal politics in Iran during the years that he was there? What were sort of the ideas that he had and the policies he pursued in vis-a-vis the cabinet and the Majlis?
Well, the Majlis has only just been given to Iran by his grandfather, and I think both he and Ahmad Shah were really too young. Ahmad Shah, after all, died at the age of 31, than my father at the age of 43 in 1943. Now, he left Persia in 1925, so he was then, presumably, around 25 years old. I don't know the exact dates or the exact ages. As in those days we didn't have identity cards, and I think the parents wrote the birth of the child in the Quran, in the Arabic sense, or the Arabic year, with the Hijr. And to translate the Hijr into Persian, again you can make mistakes. So one doesn't know the exact ages, but they were both very young. And one must understand also that at that time, the sycophants in the Persian court were quite unbelievable. I know that you had the sycophants also in the days of Reza Pahlavi, in many ways, possibly. One of the reasons for his downfall was the fact that he listened to too many. But this has always been historically a way of life in Persia, and particularly in the Persian court. In other words, everything that either Ahmad Shah said or my father said, presumably the people around them said, yes, that must be true. But in point of fact, he was not. And if you say that enough times to any young man who is impressionable and particularly personable, they're inclined to believe it and believe they can do no wrong. Difficulty has always been in Persia to find really honest men around the young Shah to advise and guide him properly, and vice versa for that young Shah to listen and do as he was advised. So it's really difficult to say. Politically, I doubt very much if they had much concern, except for the fact that I think it is well known that Ahmad Shah would never countenance the spilling of blood. There were many opportunities of disposing of Reza Khan at the time when he was in the Cossack brigade or whatever, but Ahmad Shah would never listen to it.
Okay, there were actually proposals made to sort of try to deal with...
Yes, I think many proposals were made by some people in the tribes to stop the influence of Reza Khan at that time, even to the point of getting rid of him. But as I say, Ahmad Shah would never listen to this. In fact, I think that most Persians today recognize and accept the fact that he was a remarkably good man. But being just a good man in those days, in that position, was possibly not enough to maintain and to keep that position.
Well, some of the critics have also written that he was more concerned with enjoying himself in Europe and pursuing pleasures than actually affairs of state. Do you think that's a correct judgment?
I think it's a fair comment, but to what extent, I don't know, as he was never a very strong man. Physically, he was short, and I think he suffered from glands in a way that he grew enormously fat. And I think it is correct to say that, yes, okay, he liked the flesh pots of Europe, but that I think that physically he was quite incapable of really taking advantage of them, to the extent that people might think. My father never came to Europe, as far as I know, until the Qajars fell. I know that he paid one state official visit to India, but I think that was all. In fact, I know very little about what he did or what Ahmad Shah did after I left country myself. As I say, I never saw him again.
Now, is it true that your father was sort of this more strong-willed?
Yes, he was.
Person?
He was a stronger-willed person. He was a more athletic, which is all the more reason why it was surprising when he did die at so young an age in Maidenhead, particularly after his doctors had said that he'd never suffered from anything. But he was quite definitely the stronger of the two. In fact, he was a stronger child of Muhammad Shah, both physically and mentally.
What sports did he enjoy?
Football, particularly when he was young. He was very active.
In Iran?
In Iran. But as I say, it's difficult. I spent so little time with him in Iran anyway, and I'd be brought as a child just for him to sort of say a few words and laugh and that kind of thing. I'd be taken away back to the harem again. So, as children, we never had any family life as one recognizes it, one understands it in Europe.
Now, was there any time while you were both in Europe that you spent considerable time together, or even a whole day or a half a day?
Oh yes, many times during the war I'd go down and see him in Maidenhead whenever I could, particularly between the start of the war in 1939 and when I joined the Navy in 1942. I went over to Wales after the bombings in London. He went to Wales, to Rhyl in northern Wales, and I used to visit him there from time to time during the time when I was in Mobile in London. But one never really got close to him as a son gets close to his father over here. He was just not done.
And what are the things that you would be talking about? Did he tell you anything about Iran or any sort of memories of his days in Iran?
Well, not really, because we didn't have a basic language together. His English was poor, his French was not good, my French was not good, my English was, and of course I couldn't speak Persian. As I've forgotten, since I left Iran at the age of 4 or 5, I completely forgot Persian. As I said previously, today, I never really spoke Persian as a child. I spoke Turkish, Azerbaijani Turkish. So I learned Persian the hard way when I went back to Persia in the oil business.
So therefore your Turkish had also
forgotten. The Turkish had gone completely. I had no further means of using it or opportunity. And of course my elder brother had forgotten everything except English.
So does that mean that there was no chance that for him to really tell you what was going through his mind about Iran, and in particular when Reza Shah was forced to abdicate? I imagine there must have been some reactions or thought that must have gone through.
Yes, he would talk, as I say, but as I didn't know the people he was talking about, I knew of them, but I had no knowledge of what they were or what they had done. So it didn't mean an awful lot to me. All I knew was that Reza Khan was there, and that he had taken the place of my uncle. More than that, no, I didn't know anything at all.
So when Reza Shah abdicated and left Iran and was forced to leave Iran, did your father make any comments about something that had happened to him and happened to the man who had replaced him?
My father was delighted. Obviously. Where did he leave Iran, Reza Khan? 1941.
He left Iran in September 1941 for Mauritius and then South Africa.
No, he was, yes. Because my father at that time thought that he was going to be taken back. He was firmly convinced of that. But as it didn't occur, then he started losing hope. He was firmly convinced by all the conversations that had taken place here in London that on the fall of Reza Khan we would be going back. And he really couldn't believe it when it didn't happen.
Why should the British have helped to do this? I mean, why shouldn't? What would have been the advantage to them in doing this?
I think the advantage was that they had realized in some ways they'd made a mistake with Reza Khan. If one goes back to 1932, the oil company, Reza Khan had taken over the oil company, and it was only on an understanding between Reza Khan and Lord Cadman, if my facts are right, and on the promise that Reza Khan would get 3% of the oil revenues for himself, for his own personal use, that he again allowed the oil company to operate. And I think at that time, British Petroleum, which was after all 51% owned by the British government, had started having their misgivings about the family, but they were stuck with them. There was no way of doing anything about it. Then, of course, I don't know how true it is, but southern Persia during the war was supposed to be a nest of German spies, ably abetted by Reza Khan, who knew they were there and who'd been warned to do something about it, get rid of them or clarify the situation, and wouldn't do it. But he himself, Reza Khan, never believed that he would ever be kicked out. He couldn't believe that. Until, of course, Iran was invaded.
Who were the other prominent members of the Qajar family who were in Europe? And were they at all active in affairs of state or politics, aside from your father? Any of his brothers? Or
No. Of course, the Qajars are a tribe. They're numerous, many branches. At the time, I think, of the 1925 coup, there was the family of Masood in Isfahan, who were embroiled in the coup in the form of Saram ad-Dawle Masood, as I've been told. Others like Said Ziadin, and I believe 2 or 3 others. To what extent Farman Farmayan himself was in it, one doesn't know. But as I've been told, they did help to bring about the coup against their own family.
There are some written stories that Nusrat ad-Dawla was rushing back to Tehran, I believe, from a trip to Europe, thinking that perhaps he was going to be...
Nusrat ad-Dawla Firuz, at that time, was the foreign minister to Ahmad Shah, and a very close friend, apparently, of Lord Curzon. And he was, after all, Lord Curzon, whom, I am told, did engineer the coup in the end against the Qajars, after Reza Khan had been chosen by Ironside as being the man to carry it out. But it was never the intention of Reza Khan or of others, of Reza Khan to become the Shah, or of others to make him the Shah. The original intention was that Persia would be made into a republic. But then again, the mullahs insisted that there should be a Shah, that Iran was ungovernable without a Shah because of all the various ethnic groups who realized only one thing, and that was a Shah.
I mean, it almost sounds as if the leading Qajars in Tehran were sort of helpless in preventing this thing from happening. One would think that they would have enough allies in and out of government to do something, to take some initiative to maintain the dynasty.
Well, I always believe that if Ahmad Shah had really put his foot down, and with whatever army he had, and the tribes, whom I understand were completely, in many ways completely faithful to him, and if it stood his ground, it could not have happened. Reza Khan could not have done it. But he was not in Iran at the time. He would not abdicate in favor of his brother, my father. My father was powerless to do anything because his brother was Shah. So it really was a vicious circle.
And the many telegrams which are apparently going back and forth, if we were able to read those today, what would we have found them to say?
The telegrams are in my possession. I have never read them myself because firstly because they are in Persian. Secondly because I have never had the time to decode them. But there were telegrams between my father and Ahmad Shah and vice versa. And I believe historically they could be quite interesting. But it means sitting down, going through them carefully, and doing a research job on the whole. They could, of course, be of great use to some library, presumably. I don't know, but I think the thing to do is to really research them first of all, to find out what is in them. They are in code, but the code is with them. The code is amongst the telegrams.
Okay. So to follow the path of your father when he left Iran, he actually left Iran through which border?
He was shown to the northern border. At that time there was a train, first of all by car, then by train, and I think yes, I've been told that when he left he had £100 in the bank in London and a ring on his finger on the frontier of Persia, and that ring was taken off him. And by a soldier, by one of them. By the soldiers who took him to the frontier. And I think he went by bus and train to the Lebanon, from there by ship, and eventually he landed in France.
I see.
And his first port of call was his mother's house in Saint-Cloud. Subsequently, on the advice of various friends, he chose London, or rather England anyway, as his domicile.
And where did he actually live here in England?
He lived in London until the war, and then he went to Rhyl in Wales, as I said before, during the bombings in London. And then when he came back he took a house in Maidenhead where he died.
Do you actually know where he was living in London? The house or the...
He lived... There was a hotel oblique apartments at the end of Berkeley Square, called, if I remember, Lansdowne House. He lived there for some time. And then in Half Moon Street, there's a hotel, I've forgotten the name of it now, until he set himself up first in Rhyl and then in Maidenhead.
Was there any agreement as to any funds being provided by the new regime
no.
for the Qajar family?
No. My father's own estates were Sultanat Abad and Ardashir, just north of Tehran, which are enormous, and they belonged to him. But on the death of Ahmad Shah, he declared himself in the world press as the rightful Shah of Iran, pointing out that the Qajars had never abdicated their right to the throne. And when that was issued in the press, Reza Khan confiscated the estates. The estates went, and subsequently, of course, they were used by the military. They became barracks with Ardasiye and Sultanabad, with, I think, if I'm right, little factories in Sultanabad itself.
I see. So that far down.
Oh yeah, the whole of Sultanabad, the whole of Ardasiye. So that meant that he really had no revenue at all from Iran. He had a small income from his brother, Ahmad Shah, and that was it. But he had never saved money or made money. He had never given that a thought. So,
as far as you know, how did he sort of pass his days? What would he do?
He read a lot. He saw various Persian friends when they came over here. Very quietly. He made and he had a large garden, and he looked after the garden, or tried to look after it himself. I wasn't with him. I was at the time I was either in Mobile in London, which meant I was working in London, so I saw him from time to time, and that would be the evenings. He occupied himself.
Was his wife with him?
No. He was entirely alone. He had a manservant and a cook. And that was about it.
And how about your mother? What was she doing?
Oh, in Persia. I never saw her. I didn't see my mother since I left her at the age of about 3 or 4, until I saw her again in Paris well after the war. And my elder brother Hussein, who brought up in Canada, never saw his mother. He left her at the age when he was 40 days old, and never saw her again till well after the war. But when I say well after the war, I'm talking in terms of 1947, 48.
Is either your mother or your brother's mother still living?
Oh yes, my mother's alive. She's in Tehran. My elder brother Hussein's mother died 2 years ago in Tehran.
Were these the 2 wives that your father had, or were there any?
No, we're 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Then each one from a different mother. And the others all alive in Tehran.
So what do you remember about your mother? What sort of person?
Well, she laughs a lot. She's very gay. My mother married again after the divorce of my father. She married Sepah Bodi, who's an archaeologist, and they have a daughter, Fakhri, who married a Qarani, a Colonel Qarani, who was the younger brother of General Qarani, who was killed in 1979 by a group called Forgan in Tehran, and he at that time was head of the army, but anti-mullah, and quite capable of doing a coup d'etat against the revolutionary priests, which I think he had the intention of doing. That is to say, I think that is why he was killed.
What was it like growing up in this country as member of a deposed royal family? Is it something that people, your friends, schoolmates knew about, asked you about, or is it something that was just never spoken about?
Well, they knew about it. They found it very odd in many ways, and my brother and I found it even odder because we never gave it a thought.
Mm-hmm.
We'd never grown up in the court in Persia. We had no idea of what those things meant, but it was fun in many ways. No, we didn't give it any thought. Other people gave far more thought to it than we did.
Did people address you as
no.
Your Highness or Prince or something?
No. Only if they wanted to pull our legs.
Mm-hmm.
In any event, during the years I was at sea in the Navy, I wasn't even Qajjar, I was David Drummond.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For years and years, I responded to the name of David Drummond. I've been asked to assume an English-sounding name by Sir Anthony Eden, because at that time the British recognized Reza Shah as the official Shah of Iran, and it would have been a little embarrassing to all concerned if I had been serving in the Royal Navy under my own name.
How did you happen to choose this name?
It came out of the telephone book. Out of the telephone book. I think I'm not sure if there was any other foreigner in the Royal Navy at that time as an officer, serving as an officer.
When you say it was fun, sort of having been or being a prince, can you think of any instances that bring joyful memories? Any sort of games, childhood games or school games that you played?
Well, I remember only one instance really when we were staying in Northumberland, and my guardian at that time, I won't mention any names here, was not on very good terms with the Duchess of Northumberland, which was entirely mutual. And we were invited to a hunt ball at Annie Castle, and on entering the hall, a man in a kind of uniform with a rod in his hand would tap the rod on the floor and yell your name out. And as he yelled my name out, and because she was polite, the Duchess of Northumberland had to come and curtsy, which my guardian enjoyed enormously. But that didn't alter the fact that as soon as this was done, we were relegated to the main hall, and the Duchess and her party retired to their exclusive part of the ballroom. The large cordon between them and the populace, i.e. us. It's the only thing I can remember.
When was the first time you went back to Iran, and what were your impressions and your memories of your first?
I went back in 1957, January, and I really went back only because Mrs. Allah, the wife of the then Prime Minister, I think he was Prime Minister or Minister to the Court, I'm not sure now, in 57, Mr. Allah, had met me in Paris over dinner when I was working. This is after the war now, in 1956, well after the war, when I was working in Mobil again, in Paris, Mobil Oil, and she insisted that I came back to Persia, and I could see no reason for going back to Persia. I had really no desire for going back to Persia. But she got her husband in on the deal with her, and they had to have a meeting of of the cabinet to find out whether I could go back, whether I'd be allowed to go back. They could see no difficulty, apparently, in that. Then they had to go to the Shah and ask him. And he thought a lot, and he could see no reason, or he could see again no difficulty. I was a Persian, after all.
But your family hadn't abdicated yet.
Oh no, this is all after the war. Yes, but this is all after the war.
Yeah.
In 57. We'd never abdicated the throne, ever. But there was no law. There was no law against us. I think, as far as I remember, there was only one Qajar, Salaret Dole, against whom there was a law. He could not go back, but that law against him was by his own brother, who was Muhammad Ali Shah. So, having cleared my return, then they had to think about a job for me. Now, all this time I knew nothing about what was going on. I was sitting in Paris. Then they approached a man who was then the head of the International Oil Consortium, Mr. Scholtens, the Dutchman from Shell, and he said yes, he'd be delighted to put me in a position in the consortium in Tehran. And when all this was over, I was suddenly told about it. And I thought, well, why not? I decided. So I went back. My impressions are not good at all, to start with anyway.
So you were given a job in the consortium operations in Tehran?
In Tehran.
What was...
I was assistant head of materials. And then I was sent south as head of materials and fields, in the fields areas, where the exploration and production of oil was carried out. When that was over, I did a spell in the refinery, again a separate company, but a member company of the consortium, in Abadan, returning to Tehran to take over as head of materials in Tehran for the whole of the consortium.
What were the factors or things that you saw that gave you a not very favorable impression of?
Basically corruption. Corruption at all levels.
Because with the position you had in the company, you would be in a position to see some of that.
Oh yes, well, I mean, not only I. In some cases it was so open, it was quite amazing. I was a bit naive to start with. I mean, I'd never been in the Middle East. But I realized slowly but surely that if one wanted to get anywhere, you had to be with the group and you had to have an entry into the very top. By that I mean right up as far as the Shah, if one could get. One saw this quite clearly. And it was difficult to say anything openly, to speak at all in many ways. And twice I was apprehended by the Savak because I had been too open in my condemnation of what I saw.
Right.
I never minced my words insofar as the Shah himself was concerned. I said what I thought, which possibly was not very intelligent, but I've been brought up in the Navy and I couldn't operate in any other way. But people eventually realized that I couldn't do it any other way.
Would you like to tell us about either one of those occasions with the Savak? Did you actually go to an office, or did they come to you? Or?
Well, in the first instance, they appeared in my office one day and they said that I had been accused of climbing up the wall in a hotel and bringing down the picture of the Shah and stamping all over it, which was a physical impossibility, as the picture was anyway about 20 or 25 feet high on the wall behind the reception desk. But I had to get to the desk, behind the desk, with a ladder, climb, bring the thing down and do it. However, I was taken first of all to what is called in Persian etla'at. I think that means the people who give information.
That's in the police or is it
in the police? Yes. And these two people who came to my office said, would I follow them? I tried to find out what it was all about. I couldn't speak a word of Persian then. And they tried to explain to me I was going to the etla'at and I'd learn more about it there. One of them told me he was my cousin, one of the men who came along to fetch me, by the name of Dolat Shahi. I believed him. There were so many cousins anyway that I was in no position to say he was or he wasn't my cousin. And when that was over in the Etla'at Shabwani, they hoped it was all over. So did I, and I went back to my office. But a week or 10 days later, they appeared again, and they said this time was rather more serious. They were taking me to what is called the Datsatane Artesh, that I believe is the military tribunal. And I went there, and I was faced by an Iranian Air Force officer who could speak French. He asked me the same questions. I replied in the same way. I completely denied the whole thing.
Again, the questions were concerning this alleged event of taking
the questions were entirely to do with the so-called event of the picture of the show. I denied the whole thing, and luckily they allowed me to leave.
To leave their office, or
to leave the office?
Leave the office.
Because before I went in, I'd been told by Dolat Shahi that if I had any friends in Tehran, I should then telephone them, because once you go in there, you might not come out. They let me out and produced a file on me. The file was a nuisance, because every time I wanted to leave Iran, either on business or on holiday, it was a nuisance to try and get the permission to do so because of the existence of this file. Eventually, through a friend I met, a general who was pretty high up in the army, he and I became friends, and I told him the story. And to my surprise, he just picked up the telephone one day and he telephoned somewhere or other, and the file was destroyed. So
just like that,
I was able to move again more freely. And the second time was when I was asked to go to the National Iranian Oil Company offices to see a colonel, I think his name was Tabatabai, who was the representative of Savak in NIOC, and who had, according to him, been one of the people around my father. In other words, he served my father in some capacity or other. Mm-hmm. And when I saw him in the NIOC offices, I asked him what this was about. He said he couldn't tell me himself, he didn't know, but that the Savak had asked to see me. He said he'd give me a letter to take to them, and directed me to their offices, which is just off Shah Reza, Avenue Shah Reza in Tehran. When I arrived there was three men, in other words, two youngish ones and one older. And the older one was a colonel, apparently, all wearing civilian clothes. And we did the normal thing, which was sitting up and sitting down, sitting up and sitting down, Persian politeness, passing the time of day, talking about the weather. And in the end, I was speaking in English. I still couldn't speak Persian at that time. And he asked me if I spoke any Persian at all, and I said very little. But he asked me to try and speak it with him. And after all the politenesses, I did say that the consortium, I think, considered my time as being a little important, or they wouldn't be paying me. What was all this about? He said he'd heard that in my own office I criticized the government of Iran very often. At that time, Dr. Iqbal was Prime Minister. I said, yes, I did. I was sure I did. And then I put the question to him. I said, but you say this is a free country, is it? Is it not? If it is a free country, if the government does something that I consider as an individual not to be right, I obviously criticize it. Anyway, he made me to understand that in my case it would be better if I did not criticize whatever I saw. And again, this went on for some time. It was all very pleasant. And when I was leaving, I did ask him. I said, well, look, where have you got your information from? And he told me it was from my own office. And then I did a silly thing. I asked him who in the office. And of course he just laughed and said he couldn't tell me that. And that was that. I left, and probably the next day I criticized the government again, but I think they were getting used to me by then, so they left it.
So you continued working in Iran until what year?
1971, when I came back to London in Mobile, and a year later transferred from Mobile to Iranian Oil Services in London, which was and had always been the buying and service organization in London for the worldwide, in London for the Iranian Oil Consortium, in providing materials, staff, literally a service organization for Iran.
What was it like going back to Iran, to the place where your father was the heir apparent, and obviously people must have known who you were?
Yes, it wasn't
working as an executive within a company. It must have been very difficult.
Well, in many ways it was. In many ways, one of the things which was the most difficult was the fact that I'd never realized how many Qajars there really were. As I said, it's a tribe, and wherever I went, whatever party I attended, I'd meet people who would turn around and say they were my cousins, through so-and-so, through this person, through that person, which never meant anything to me. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy going back with the name I carried, because really all the others had in one way or another been brought up between Persia and Europe or America, but they'd never lost their touch or contact with Persia. They all spoke Persian, and in a way one felt completely, in a way, isolated. It was not easy, particularly, as I say, carrying the name I carried. Because, okay, all the others supposedly were Qajars in some shape or other, but they were not of the same source as I was. And of course a lot of them, their bread and butter depended upon the Shah and the court. They were nearly all in business, in the kind of business one does in Persia, whereas I was with the international, normal European oil consortium.
Did you actually go to North Tehran to look at the estates that were owned by your father?
Well, I used to pass them every time I went up to Shemran. I couldn't believe at their size. I was told at one time that the qanat, that's the water well in Ardashir, alone was worth over 5 million tamans. And here was I working for the consortium for a pittance. But I think that what my father did to declare himself the rightful Shah of Persia on the death of his brother Ahmad Shah was right. I don't think he could have done anything else. But I also think that he, in doing that, should not have given rise to Reza Khan in confiscating my father's own private personal estates. They were nothing to do with the crown, nothing to do with they were his own estates. If they'd belonged to the crown, I could understand it. But in fact, I think I'm right in saying that not one single palace during the time of the Qajars belonged to the Qajars. They all belonged to the crown. Whereas afterwards, each palace which was built by Reza Khan and his children belonged to him personally.
If the son of the late Shah, who is now living in exile outside of Iran, came to you, a person who, with some of the circumstances, 40 years ago, and said, give me some advice in 25 words or less, as a person, as a one man giving it to a young man, what do you think you would say to him?
Don't believe those around you, particularly if they're Persians, without giving it considerable thought, and be incorruptible, if you can.
I mean, I've heard people say that perhaps he should have continued his studies at a college that he was attending. He's going to a very good college in Massachusetts named Williams.
The whole story of the flight of the Pahlavi family to America is a little murky, and I don't think one will ever really know the truth. I believe his father tried to give him the kind of education that he honestly thought the son should have, and I think that the son in a way was a little young to be corrupted. Well, a little young when he left or was forced to leave Iran, to have begun to becoming corrupted by those around him. Of course, I don't know the atmosphere he lived in, but I believe that in any event, I know that his mother was brought up completely normally, in her case, without money in France, and presumed that her influence had something on him. But I think those days are over. Nothing ever goes back anyway historically. You either go forward or you stop a little while. But I think the days of Shahs in Iran is over. Unless, of course, one puts forward the argument that Iran really needs a Shah because of all the various ethnic groups. But I would think that a strong man at the head of a strong democracy would do just as well where the ethnic groups are concerned as any Shah. But that's my own feeling, it's my own opinion.
Was Qawam Sultana related to the Qajars?
No, Qawam Sultana was the brother of another great man, Wusul ad-Dawla, but I believe Qawam was greater than his brother. I didn't know his brother, but this is what I'm told by all concerned. Qawam for Iran was a great person. The last I would say that I know of anybody being a great person in Persia. He was of the old school, but yet modern. He was put in a position to overthrow Dr. Mossadegh, which he did for a very short while, but in a way it came too late, because Qawam was too old at that time to carry out an operation of that nature. And of course, the crowds in the streets were too much for him. I think it's common knowledge that the crowds in the street in any event would always appear if there was 10 Taman notes being distributed. They never did it of their own free will as such. I don't think they had any free will. And but I think that if Qawam had been able to, if he had been 20 years younger, he could have done something quite big. He was, after all, responsible really for getting the Russians out of Azerbaijan after the war. Although I know that history books were written to the effect that it was the Persian army that did it. But the truth is not quite that.
Did you ever meet Qawam?
I met Qawam in Paris. We came to London together on a trip when he was meeting various people in the British government.
This is in the 50s, in the early 50s.
Yeah. Just before actually the overthrow of Mossadegh for that short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
I liked him. He was a very vain man, oddly enough, even at that pretty advanced age.
To all people, or to people who he considered belonging?
No, by vain I mean that to the extent that although he had little hair, he used to paint hair on his head.
Right.
He was vain in his own personal appearances and dress and that kind of thing. No, I think that of all the Persians that I met, and there are quite a number who are supposedly great men, or they think they are great men, I think Qawam stood head and shoulders above them all.
Yeah, what was it about him that impressed you? I had never having had the fortune of ever meeting him.
He was a big man, not so big in height, but he was a powerful man. He had tremendous personality. He had much more personality than people like Hoveyda, for instance. I mean, there's no comparison of that kind of thing. Or Amuzagar, or Erbar, or any of them.
Was he a man that one would feel warm towards when you met him, or feared, or
no, you respected him. You respected him, and you automatically gave him the respect due to him, without really thinking too much about it. He had that kind of personality.
There's one paragraph written in Princess Ashraf's book, and she says that in describing Qawam, she says that he did not allow any chairs to be placed in his office, so that the visitor was not able to sit in his presence, and that you could not address him directly. I think you had to address your question or whatever you wanted to say through his secretary. Does that sound plausible?
Well, it sounds plausible because that is well within the Persian character in Persia, dealing with ordinary Persians.
Mm-hmm.
But don't forget that Qawam served my father.
Yes.
There's a picture of him on the wall, actually. He served my father, and his relationship with me was quite different. In any event, there was nothing Persian about me like you'd get the Persian in Persia going to a government office.
So did you see him with other Persians?
I saw him, yes, I saw
how he
him.
would behave with them?
I never saw him with Persians, unless they were within his own immediate family. By that I mean his son. I never saw him, I never saw him with Persians serving him as such. But I can quite imagine, having seen what I saw during the years I was in Persia, that in his particular case, and as I say, he was a much more powerful man than any of the others, the average Persian behavior towards him would be completely servile.
How was he with foreigners? How did he behave in the presence of important foreigners?
He wasn't at a disadvantage, except in the language problem.
Presumably he spoke no English.
He spoke very, very little English. In fact, he spoke no French, as far as I remember.
Really?
As far as I remember, he spoke no French. Although he came from a school of Persians that when French was really the second language in the country. I think he felt in the presence of a foreigner he didn't feel at a disadvantage, but he obviously was not in the same position with the foreigner here as he would have been with the Persian. What I'm trying to say really is that a person normally should be exactly the same with both. There should be no difference between the two. But having been brought up, the usual Persian fawning around a greater man is inclined to corrupt that man, unless that man is a very, very strong man. But of course there isn't that aspect of it with the foreigner, unless the foreigner is in Persia trying to get a contract from him, probably.
I mean, did he maintain sort of a strong, silent image with foreigners, or did he seem sort of over-friendly, which was sort of the opposite side of the coin?
No, the strong, silent image. Spoke when he was spoken to, or when he wanted to speak.
So he sort of maintained his dignity.
Oh yes, he maintained his dignity completely. No servility about him. But not obviously in the same position as he would be with the Persian. One could feel that.
So in what language did you speak with him?
In broken Persian.
Really?
I think even if he'd spoken English a little better, he would still not have spoken English, because he'd wanted his Persian to be translated into English. That's what he would want.
So he was of the school that would have spoken his own native language.
Yes, and he was he was very cunning. He was very clever. He was very cunning. But to the extent that a Persian politician is straight, I would say he was straight.
Did he seem a man of strong convictions, or was he a man that was pragmatic and therefore willing to sort of bend with the wind? How would you describe it?
No, he had strong convictions. But what surprised me was that even at that advanced age, he still wanted power. He still wanted to get back into power again.
People have accused him of having very negative attitude toward the Pahlavi dynasty, and there are reports in the State Department archives that the Shah feared Qavam, and thought that perhaps Qavam wanted to replace him as President of the Republic rather than as Shah's Prime Minister.
Well, that wouldn't surprise me. I don't think he thought an awful lot of the Pahlavis. Well, there are many of that school who did not think very much of the Pahlavis, but were not in a position to do anything about it. Mm-hmm. I've forgotten now, but I believe there were 3 or 4 of them. One of them was Mr. Allah, who refused to sign the piece of paper in the Majlis to bring the Pahlavis to power. Tarizadeh I knew in London. I met him in London a number of times. He was also of the same school as Qajar, in many ways like him. Mm-hmm. He'd been ambassador in London, I think, for some years. Yes. I'd never met him as a young man in England. I met him really the first time at the time of my father's death. Mm-hmm. And I was impressed by the man. I liked the man. But as I say, difficult to talk to. There's always this barrier amongst Persians when they meet for the first time, and is that they're usually so mistrustful of each other that they just will not speak to each other at all openly. They're trying to. They think that each one is going to do something to the other for some unknown reason, so they're never really open unless they become very close friends. Mm-hmm. But first meetings are always difficult with Persians. There's a lot of hypocrisy to this as well. I mean, in many parties in Tehran, I used to go to. Each Iranian was suspicious of the other, unless they knew each other very well. And they all enjoyed a drink, but being offered a drink, they say, no, I never touch it. I have orange juice or tomato juice. Then, on return to his own home, he'd open the bottle and drink like a fish, but not in front of the other Persians. He would, which always surprised me, because to me it was a sheer hypocrisy.
Especially since you hadn't been brought up in Iran, you'd been brought up in this country.
Yes, I never understood it. Because each other Persian knew that this is exactly what the fellow was going to do anyway when he got home. But it was the accepted thing. You pretend all the time.
What sort of impression do you think the foreigners, particularly the British, had about Qajar? Did they have respect for him?
I think they'd respect him. I don't know if they'd trust him. I think they'd respect him. In other words, I think that they would find it difficult, or they would have found it difficult, to get Qajar to be their lackey. So from that point of view, I think they would not be open with him.
So therefore, sort of statements by people that Qajar was the man of the British, or he was man of this or that, you don't find?
No, I don't find that credible, really. You say a man of the British, but the question is to what degree, to what extent. If it serves Qajar at any point to work with the British, he would do it. Mm-hmm. But from there to become a real lackey of the British, I doubt that. To me, it would be out of context, out of character.
Of course, in 1946, it was said that Qajar was the man of the Russians.
Yes, but it was in 1946 or nearabouts when he, because of the oil business in the Caspian, he managed to get the Russians to come out of Iran. No, I don't think he was a man. I think Qajar, no, I think he was an honest, patriotic Persian. And very much for Qajar himself as well.
But did you feel he had sort of feelings and thoughts about Iran? What Iran should become, what should be done for Iran?
I don't think he went that far because he was too much of the old school. His education had not taken him as a young man to that extent. I think Qajar was for Persia. independent Persia and for Qavam himself. I don't think he thought in terms of factories and railways and hospitals and I don't know, the welfare state sort of thing.
How about in terms of the Constitution, independence, freedom, those kinds of things?
I think he thought in terms of the Constitution. I don't think he thought too much in terms of freedom of the individual, because I think he always thought that the Persian was really ungovernable unless there was a whip, unless there was strength behind the government. No, I don't think he'd have been the kind of man to give too much freedom to the men in the street, because I think that he would have thought that if you do that, the Persian becomes an anarchist, practically.
Again, in 1946, he was accused of sort of being a tool of Muzaffar Firuz by the Americans. Does that?
I think the Americans are mistaken. I think it was the other way around. I think Muzaffar Firuz may well have thought that Qavam was his tool, where in reality Muzaffar turned out historically to have been Qawam's tool. Qavam used him to create the Ministry of Labour. Qavam saw his danger, I think, at the time of the Said Ziauddin fiasco, when Muzaffar Firuz brought Said Ziauddin back to Iran from Palestine, couldn't work with him and imprisoned him. I think Qavam saw the danger in Firuz, and I think that Firuz's open hatred towards the Shah at that time did not serve Qawam's purpose for Qavam, so he sent Firuz to Russia as ambassador, knowing full well that it was only for a year or thereabouts, at which time Firuz would be out. And Firuz since then, I'm talking about 1947, has never been back in Persia. I think Firuz, if he'd ever gone back to Persia during those years, would have been immediately taken and imprisoned by the Shah.
So, knowing something about the personality of Qavam and Firuz, you can't imagine 1946 Qavam being a puppet of Firuz,
no.
as he was accused of being.
No.
And if it appeared that way, he was pretending for his own purposes.
I think Firuz may well have thought that, or wished that, or hoped that, but I think that quietly it was the other way around. Qavam was a much deeper man than Firuz. In many ways, much more the statesman than the politician. Qavam had been on the Persian stage worldwide for some considerable time. His brother Vusur-ed-Dawla also had been, but Vusur-ed-Dawla was not as great a man, in my opinion, as his brother. Although I know little about Vusur-ed-Dawla. I'm only talking from hearsay.
But it was, as I said, the American ambassador, George Allen, who reported to his government that in one of the criticisms of Qavam, he states that Qavam is too much under the control and the thumb of Muzaffar Firuz.
I think that Allen was misled. I think Allen was too naive in thinking that. I think you would find that the British would not have thought that. Again, that's my own opinion.
Obviously, Muzaffar Firuz is someone that you've known for...
Oh yes, I've known him for a year. I've known him since 1947. I like the man enormously. He's very sharp, very quick. But he obviously did not play his cards right. Or he'd have foreseen that Qavam was going to send him. He'd have foreseen that Qavam was a deep man. What I'm trying to say really is that if Muzaffar had been a different kind of a man, he would not have put himself in the position of Qavam. getting rid of him to Russia and then completely out of the Persian Foreign Service.
Have you ever met with any of the Pahlavis? Social.
I had lunch, or was it dinner, I've forgotten which, with Abdul Reza in Paris.
What was it like for a member of one dynasty to meet another?
He was quite a pleasant young man. He was on his way back to Iran after being educated in America.
I see, this was 1947 or 1948.
Yes. Yeah. He was a very pleasant young man. To my mind, there was no personality, nothing to give any kind of impression to me that the man was the brother of a king or something like that. But to me, he looked just like any other Persian, except possibly better looking than the average Persian at that time. No, there was no impression at all made on me by him, none whatsoever.
Well, I had more sort of a feeling that he is now in a position or a situation that my family was X years ago. This kind of a...
No, not at all. Oddly enough, well, you know that the Pahlavis are my cousins as well on their mother's side. Dola Chais.
I see, yeah.
The Shah was not. Ashraf is not.
Shams is not.
Shams is not. Which is a big fat fella.
Ghulam Reza.
Ghulam Reza is.
Yes.
Abdul Reza is. Hamid Mirza is. Their mothers are all Qajars.
I wonder what it was like for them, being members of two different dynasties.
But in 47 things were very different. This was Abdul Reza was a young fellow, just brought up and finished schooling in the States, and I thought probably he thought the same about me as I thought about him. I made it very plain that I wasn't enormously enamored by his brother, who was then the Shah. I mean,
you told him that?
Oh, I told him. He laughed. I don't think he gave a damn. I don't think within their own family they get on with each other anyway. I think the only strong one they had in that family was the brother who was killed in the airplane crash.
Ali Reza.
Ali Reza.
Did you ever meet him?
I used to see him in Paris with his Polish wife. We used to frequent the same bar in the Porte Dauphine. Again, if you saw... to me, there was never anything really to distinguish the Pahlavis as being something rather different to the average. It was so ordinary-looking people. Ali Reza certainly was not a good-looking person, in the same way as his brother Abdul Reza. But he gave the impression of more character. He gave the impression of possibly being sharper, more character, more guts.
This is Ali Reza.
Was Ali Reza? That's the impression I got. But a very ordinary looking young man, I mean not even good looking, Ali Reza, to my mind wasn't. I met Ashraf, of course, in Paris many times, at the time when she was kicked out by Dr. Mossadegh. And I have a great aunt who lives in Paris, who was very fond of gambling, used to take us to the casinos and that kind of thing. And of course at that time Ashraf had no money. And she used to come along and borrow money from my aunt all the time, in the casino to go and play. Lose and come back and borrow some more. She had no money at that time. I thought her very attractive, good looking. Well, more attractive. No, she was both attractive and good looking. Small. Appeal, a lot of appeal. Again, well, I'm told that she's much stronger than her brother, who was a Shah, which often happens in the case of twins. But I think she's got a lot to answer for. After meeting you, did she make any sort of comments about No.
Who you were?
No. We spoke. Just if I was speaking to any other woman, she was speaking to any other man. I mean, there's no...
She talked politics with you?
No, I think... No, I don't think she really started into it at that time. Maybe perhaps she just started. So we're talking now about 1952. 52.
And the fact that she had been forced to leave Iran and be in France, not by choice.
No, she didn't mention that. She had a bevy of young people who were around her all the time. As I say, I only met her once or twice, and that was in the casino when she was borrowing money to play.
Well, thank you for giving me and all the people who the next decades will be listening to this tape.
Pretty disjointed.
Well, I think you haven't heard some others.
No.